6-year-old boy sneaks into Millionaire's garden to steal flowers for his dead mother's birthday. What happens next changes 3 broken lives forever. If you enjoy emotional stories like this, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any. The first light of dawn barely touched the sky when small fingers gripped the rough stone wall. 6-year-old Noah James took a deep breath, his worn sneakers searching for footholds in the ivy-covered barrier. His grandmother had always come with him before, but this morning her breathing had been too labored, her fever too high. "I'll be back soon, Nana," he had whispered, tucking the thin blanket around her shoulders before slipping out of their one-bedroom apartment. It was his mother's birthday, and nothing would stop him from bringing her flowers, not even the intimidating wall surrounding the neighborhood's most impressive mansion. With determination bigger than his small frame, Noah pulled himself up and over, landing with a soft thud on perfectly manicured grass. His eyes widened at the sight before him, roses in every color imaginable, tulips standing proud, and delicate lilies that his mother had always loved. "These are perfect, Mommy," he whispered, his voice catching. 2 years without her felt like forever to his young heart. Noah moved carefully between the flower beds, selecting each bloom with purpose. A pink rose for love, a white lily because they were her favorite, a bright yellow tulip because she always said sunshine lived in that color. Dirt smudged his cheeks as he knelt to pull a particularly beautiful lily from the soil, wanting its roots intact so it might last longer at her grave. He didn't hear the security alert ping inside the mansion or the quick footsteps approaching across the lawn. The boy was so focused on gently extracting the flower that the booming voice behind him felt like thunder breaking across a clear sky. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Noah froze, flowers clutched against his chest, terror racing through his small body as he turned to face the towering figure of Jonathan Gardner, whose garden he had invaded before the world was properly awake. Jonathan Gardner had already been awake for hours, sleep once again eluding him as it often did, since the doctors had confirmed what he and his wife Rebecca had feared after years of trying: they would never have biological children. At 35, the tech company he'd built from nothing had made him wealthy beyond imagination, but the nursery down the hall remained empty, a painted room full of ghosts of children who would never exist. The security alert on his phone had been almost welcome, a distraction from his thoughts, but finding a child, a thief, in his prized garden ignited something volatile in him. "Those flowers cost more than you can imagine," he snapped, reaching for the boy's arm. "Where are your parents? Do they know you're trespassing?" Noah's small body trembled, the carefully gathered flowers shaking in his grip. I'm sorry, sir," he stammered, tears welling in his eyes, streaking clean lines through the dirt on his face. "They're for my mommy. It's her birthday today." He swallowed hard, trying to be brave the way his grandmother had taught him. "She's in heaven now, and I always bring her flowers on her birthday. Nana is too sick to come with me this time." The words tumbled out in a frightened rush, his voice small against the grandeur of the estate surrounding them. He didn't try to run. His grandmother had always told him to own up to his mistakes. Jonathan felt something shift in his chest at the boy's words, but years of business negotiations had taught him to keep his face impassive. He noticed now what anger had blinded him to seconds before. The child's clothes were clean but worn thin at the knees and elbows, his shoes scuffed and at least a size too small. The flowers were clutched with such care, such reverence. "Your mother is," he found himself saying, the heat of his anger cooling rapidly. Behind him he heard the patio door slide open and turned to see Rebecca step outside, her silk robe pulled tight against the morning chill, confusion evident on her face as she took in the scene before her. Rebecca Gardner approached cautiously, her bare feet silent on the dewy grass. At 33, she carried herself with the practiced elegance that came from years in high society, but the gentle curve of her face betrayed a kindness her husband sometimes lacked. "Jonathan?" she questioned, eyes moving from her husband's rigid posture to the small boy clutching flowers, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. The child looked terrified, and something maternal stirred in her chest, a feeling she had tried to suppress since their last failed fertility treatment 6 months ago. The doctor's words still haunted her dreams. unexplained infertility, a diagnosis that explained nothing while taking everything. He was stealing flowers, Jonathan said, but the accusation had lost its edge. He watched his wife's expression soften as she knelt before the boy, careful to keep her expensive robe from touching the ground, a habit from years of maintaining appearances. Rebecca had been different once, before society galas and charity functions had become their life, before the nursery down the hall had been painted 4 different colors in anticipation of children who never came. Sometimes Jonathan wondered if they even knew each other anymore, their conversations reduced to schedules and social obligations, the weight of their unfulfilled dreams hanging between them like an invisible wall. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Rebecca asked, her voice gentle in a way Jonathan hadn't heard in months. The boy sniffled, trying to stand tall despite his obvious fear. "Noah James, ma'am," he replied, with unexpected politeness. "I'm 6 years old." His knuckles were white around the flower stems, as if afraid they might be taken away. "These are for my mommy. She loved flowers more than anything." The past tense wasn't lost on Rebecca, whose eyes flickered briefly to Jonathan's. There was a dignity in the child's posture that seemed far older than his years, a responsibility that no 6-year-old should have to carry. Jonathan felt a twinge of shame at his outburst. The boy, Noah, was just a child, and clearly one who had already experienced loss no child should face. He thought of the empty room upstairs, of Rebecca's tears that had eventually dried into a resigned silence, more painful than her crying had ever been. "Where's your mother buried, Noah?" he found himself asking, his voice gentler now. The question seemed to surprise both the child and Rebecca, whose eyebrows lifted slightly. Noah pointed vaguely toward the east side of town, where Jonathan knew the public cemetery spread across several acres. "She has a stone with angels," the boy explained, serious. "Today she would be 32. Rebecca stood smoothly, decision made before Jonathan could process what was happening. "We'll take you there," she said simply, her hand reaching out to Noah, who looked up at her with cautious hope. "You shouldn't be walking across town alone, especially today." Jonathan wanted to object. They had the Henderson brunch at 11, calls with Tokyo investors in the afternoon, but the words died on his lips when he saw something flicker in Rebecca's eyes. Purpose, the first real emotion he'd seen there in months. Noah hesitated, looking from Rebecca's outstretched hand to Jonathan's face, clearly assessing whether the man who had just yelled at him could be trusted. "Will you help me plant one of the lilies?" the boy asked finally. "Mommy always said flowers should keep their roots." Jonathan found himself nodding before he could think better of it. "Let me change," Rebecca said, already turning toward the house. "And we should bring water for the lilies. Jonathan, find a small trowel from the gardening shed." Her voice held an authority he hadn't heard in ages, and he found himself moving toward the shed without argument. As he selected a suitable garden tool, Jonathan glanced back at the boy who stood awkwardly on their perfect lawn, flowers clutched to his chest, waiting with the patient resignation of a child who had learned early that life often required waiting. Something tightened in Jonathan's chest, recognition perhaps of something lost or something found. He wasn't sure which. The cemetery looked different in daylight than it had during the funeral procession 2 years earlier. Noah walked with confidence between the headstones, the path clearly familiar to his small feet, despite the time that had passed. Jonathan drove his Bentley slowly through the gates, feeling strangely out of place among the modest graves and simple bouquets. Rebecca sat silently beside him, her eyes following Noah's red jacket as the boy led them deeper into the cemetery. They had stopped at their house only long enough to change clothes and gather supplies, a thermos of hot chocolate, garden tools, and a container of water for the flowers. The Henderson brunch had been cancelled with a brief text message that had surprised Jonathan. Rebecca hadn't cancelled a social obligation in years. "Here she is," Noah announced, stopping before a simple grey headstone. "Eleanor Marie James, beloved mother and daughter," Jonathan read silently, noting the dates that confirmed Noah's words. She would indeed have been 32 today. The grave was well tended despite its simplicity, with signs that someone regularly cleared away leaves and debris. Noah knelt before the stone with practiced ease, arranging his stolen flowers with careful precision. "Happy birthday, Mommy," he said quietly. "Nana couldn't come today because she's sick, but I brought your favorites anyway." His small fingers traced the engraved letters of his mother's name with familiarity born of ritual. Jonathan stepped back, suddenly feeling like an intruder in this intimate moment between a boy and the memory of his mother. Rebecca moved forward instead, kneeling beside Noah on the damp grass without concern for her designer jeans. "Would you like to plant the lily now?" she asked gently. Noah nodded, selecting the white bloom he had carefully protected during their journey. Jonathan watched as his wife helped the boy dig a small hole near the headstone, their hands working together in the soil. There was something primal about the scene, life being planted at the site of death, Rebecca's manicured fingers dirty for the first time in years, Noah's face intense with concentration. The spring sun broke through the clouds as they patted the soil firmly around the flower's roots, as if nature itself approved of their offering. "She was a maid," Noah said suddenly, still looking at the grave. "Mommy cleaned houses for rich people. She said honest work with your hands is nothing to be ashamed of." His matter-of-fact tone carried no self-pity, just the pure acceptance children often have before the world teaches them to judge such things. "She got sick real fast. Nana says sometimes angels need good people urgently." He sat back on his heels, apparently satisfied with their planting job. Rebecca remained beside him, seemingly unbothered by the dirt now staining her knees, her eyes fixed on the dates carved in stone, only 29 when she died, leaving behind a 4-year-old son. Jonathan felt like an outsider to their shared moment, standing awkwardly with his Italian leather shoes carefully placed to avoid the damp ground. The contrast between Noah's worn jacket, clearly a hand-me-down that he'd grow into eventually, and Rebecca's casual outfit that cost more than many people's monthly rent, wasn't lost on him. What kind of life did this boy have now? The question formed unbidden in his mind as Noah began telling the headstone about his week at school, about how his grandmother had taught him to make her special tea, about a bird's nest he'd found in the park. The intimacy of the one-sided conversation made something ache deep in Jonathan's chest, an emptiness he'd been trying to fill with acquisitions and achievements. "Noah," Rebecca said gently when the boy finally fell silent, "we should get you home now. Your grandmother will be worried." Noah nodded, reluctantly rising from his kneeling position. He pressed his small palm flat against the stone in farewell, a gesture so practiced and natural that Jonathan realized it must be his regular goodbye. "I'll come back soon, Mommy," the boy promised quietly. As they walked back toward the car, Noah's small hand slipped trustingly into Rebecca's, a gesture that made her steps falter momentarily. Jonathan saw something cross his wife's face, longing, pain, or perhaps both, before she squeezed the small fingers gently and continued walking. Not for the first time that morning, Jonathan felt like he was witnessing something significant, shifting between the carefully constructed walls of their perfect life. The address Noah gave them led to the older part of town, where once grand Victorian homes had long ago been divided into small apartments. Jonathan navigated the Bentley down streets that narrowed and deteriorated with each turn, feeling increasingly out of place in the luxury vehicle. Children playing on the sidewalk stopped to stare as they passed, the car as alien in this neighborhood as a spaceship would be. Noah directed them with simple instructions, left at the big tree, right where the blue store is, until they pulled up before a 3-story building with peeling paint and a sagging front porch. "I live on the top floor with Nana," he explained, unbuckling his seatbelt with practiced ease. "We'll walk you up," Rebecca said firmly, already opening her door before Jonathan could object. Something in her tone brooked no argument, and Jonathan found himself following his wife and the boy up cracked concrete steps. The building's interior smelled of cabbage and dampness, the narrow staircase worn in the center from decades of footsteps. Noah climbed steadily, his small legs taking the stairs with practiced determination. 3 flights up, Jonathan was only slightly winded, but he noticed Rebecca's careful scan of their surroundings, the water stains spreading across the ceiling, the flickering hallway light, the multiple locks on each apartment door speaking to security concerns. Noah stopped at apartment 3C, turning a key hung around his neck on a shoelace. "Nana, I'm back," he called as he pushed the door open. The apartment beyond was small but meticulously clean, with furniture that had seen better days but was arranged with care. What struck Jonathan immediately was how few possessions were visible. No excess, nothing frivolous, just the bare necessities arranged with dignity. A narrow hallway led to what appeared to be 2 small bedrooms, and from one came a weak cough, followed by a tremulous voice. "Noah? Baby, is that you?" The voice held relief, tinged with worry. "I've been so concerned. Where have you been all this time?" Noah rushed down the hallway, disappearing into what must be his grandmother's bedroom, his excited voice floating back to them. "I took flowers to Mommy, Nana, and these nice people helped me plant a lily that will grow there forever." Jonathan and Rebecca remained awkwardly in the small living area, strangers in a world far removed from their own. Through the thin walls, Jonathan could hear Noah recounting their morning adventure to his grandmother, his child's voice painting their actions in heroic terms that made Jonathan uncomfortable. They weren't heroes. They had simply done what any decent person would do. Yet the boy's gratitude made him acutely aware of how little it had cost them. Time, nothing more, and how significant it had clearly been to Noah. Rebecca moved to the kitchen area, her designer boots silent on the worn linoleum. Jonathan watched as she took in the sparse cupboards, visible through a missing door, the ancient refrigerator humming loudly with effort, the single pot soaking in the sink. Her face revealed nothing, but her shoulders tensed in a way Jonathan recognized from their most difficult moments, when she was fighting emotion. Before either could speak, Noah reappeared, towing a frail-looking elderly woman leaning heavily on a wooden cane. "Nana, these are the nice people who took me to see Mommy. They have a garden with the most beautiful flowers ever." Margaret James was thin to the point of gauntness, her skin papery and pale, but her dark eyes, so like Noah's, were sharp and dignified, despite the fever flush on her hollow cheeks. "Thank you for looking after my grandson," she said, her voice stronger than her appearance suggested. "I would never have let him go alone if I'd known." She swayed slightly, and Rebecca stepped forward instinctively, helping her to a worn armchair. Jonathan could see the effort it took for the woman to remain upright, to maintain her composure before strangers. Pride and illness fought visibly across her features as she settled into the chair, her breath coming in short, labored gasps that spoke of infection and exhaustion. "Noah was no trouble," Rebecca assured her, kneeling beside the chair with natural grace. "We were happy to help." Jonathan stood awkwardly behind his wife, struck by how easily Rebecca slipped into conversation with this woman whose life could not be more different from their own. As they spoke, he studied the apartment more carefully. The carefully mended curtains, the single-framed photograph of a younger Margaret with a beautiful dark-haired woman who must be Eleanor, Noah's mother. There were schoolbooks on the small table, neatly stacked, and a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator showed 3 stick figures, a small one, a medium one with wings, and a tall one with a cane. Family, reduced to its most essential elements by a child's understanding. Something tightened in Jonathan's throat. The next morning, Jonathan sat in his home office staring at his computer screen without seeing the financial reports displayed there. His mind kept returning to the cramped apartment, to Noah's careful handling of his meager possessions, to Margaret's obvious illness. After an awkward departure the previous day, Rebecca insisting on leaving her phone number, in case you need anything, they had returned to their spacious home in silence. Dinner had been eaten separately, Jonathan claiming work demands while Rebecca disappeared into the unused nursery for nearly an hour. They were strangers again. The brief connection forged through helping Noah seemingly evaporated upon return to their normal lives. The intercom buzzed, his assistant's voice coming through with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Gardner, your 10 a.m. has cancelled. Mrs. Gardner asked me to remind you about the charity gala planning committee at noon." Jonathan acknowledged the message automatically, then found himself opening a browser window. He typed Margaret James, along with their city name, then added, Elena James' death when the first search yielded too many results. The local newspaper's archives provided what he was looking for, a brief obituary from 2 years earlier. Elena James, 29, passed away after a brief battle with aggressive lymphoma. She is survived by her son, Noah, and her mother, Margaret. Elena worked as a domestic housekeeper and was known for her kind heart and strong work ethic. Services will be held. The sparse details painted a picture of a life ended too soon, with no mention of Noah's father or extended family, just a grandmother suddenly responsible for raising a young grandson while grieving her daughter. Jonathan leaned back in his ergonomic chair, the contrast between his cushioned existence and their precarious one uncomfortably stark. His company had donated millions to cancer research foundations, tax-deductible contributions that made for good press releases, but suddenly seemed hollow compared to the reality of one small family devastated by the disease. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then set it down again. What was he thinking? They weren't his responsibility. Yet Noah's serious face kept appearing in his mind, the careful way the boy had planted the lily, his quiet acceptance of circumstances no child should have to accept. The knock on his office door surprised him. Rebecca rarely interrupted his workday. She entered without waiting for his response. Something different in her bearing, a determination he hadn't seen in months. "I called Dr. Mercer," she announced without preamble. "Margaret James needs medical attention she clearly isn't getting. He's agreed to see her this afternoon as a favor to us." Jonathan blinked, processing his wife's words. Dr. Mercer was their personal physician, a concierge doctor whose exclusive practice catered to the wealthy. "Rebecca," he began, unsure what he was even objecting to, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "I already called her," Rebecca continued, meeting his gaze directly. "She didn't want to accept, but I convinced her it was for Noah's sake." Something flickered across Rebecca's face, a mix of emotions Jonathan couldn't quite identify. "That woman is all he has, Jonathan. Did you see how thin she was? The way she could barely stand. Noah can't lose her too." The passion in her voice caught him off guard. For months they had moved through their lives like ghosts, the failed fertility treatments creating a gulf between them that widened with each passing day. Now Rebecca stood before him, vibrant with purpose, more alive than she'd been in longer than he could remember. Jonathan found himself nodding before he'd fully processed his own thoughts on the matter. "I'll drive them," he offered, surprising himself as much as Rebecca, whose eyebrows lifted slightly. Something passed between them, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of it. "I have that acquisition call at 2, but I can reschedule." The words felt foreign in his mouth. Jonathan Gardner didn't reschedule business calls for anyone, yet here he was, pushing aside a multi-million-dollar negotiation for a boy who stole flowers and his ailing grandmother. Rebecca's expression softened, a ghost of her former smile touching her lips before she nodded and turned to leave. At the door, she paused, looking back at him with something like the warmth they'd once shared. "Thank you," she said simply, and then was gone. As Jonathan sent the email rescheduling his call, he found himself wondering about Noah's father, conspicuously absent from both the obituary and the apartment. Another thought followed, unbidden and unsettling. If circumstances had been different, if Elena James had cleaned houses in their neighborhood instead of across town, might she have worked for them? Might Noah have been one of the invisible children of the working poor that he drove past daily without seeing? The thought left him uncomfortable, in a way that charitable donations never had. Writing checks was easy. Seeing the reality of Margaret and Noah's life, and acknowledging his own blindness to such realities, was considerably harder. Jonathan closed his laptop decisively. Some things, it seemed, required more than money to fix. They required presence, and for the first time in years he felt compelled to be present for something beyond his business empire. 2 weeks passed, during which the Gardners' ordered life underwent a subtle but significant transformation. What had begun as a simple doctor's appointment had evolved into regular visits to the Jameses' apartment, with Rebecca bringing home-cooked meals despite having rarely used their gourmet kitchen before, and Jonathan finding reasons to stop by. A children's book Noah might enjoy, information about a school program that offered scholarships. Dr. Mercer's diagnosis had been concerning but not immediately dire. Pneumonia complicated by unmanaged diabetes and arthritis. With proper medication and care, Margaret could recover her strength, but the underlying conditions required ongoing management they clearly couldn't afford. Noah gradually warmed to their presence, his initial wariness giving way to cautious acceptance as they became regular fixtures in his small world. Jonathan discovered the boy had an aptitude for mathematics that his underfunded school wasn't nurturing, while Rebecca found he loved to draw but had only a handful of broken crayons and scavenged paper to work with. Small gifts appeared, a proper sketch pad, quality-colored pencils, a used tablet loaded with educational games that Jonathan pretended was outdated technology from the office. Margaret watched these developments with a mixture of gratitude and pride, accepting help for Noah's sake while maintaining a dignity that commanded respect. "He looks like her," Margaret confided to Rebecca one afternoon, while Noah sat at the small kitchen table, absorbed in a math puzzle Jonathan had brought him. Same serious eyes, same way of thinking deeply about everything. The older woman's health had improved with proper medication, but the years and her hardships had taken their toll. Recovery was slow. Elena would have given anything to see him grow up. There was resignation in her voice, but also a steely determination. "I promised her I'd be here for him, but some days—" She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. The fear hung unspoken between them. What would happen to Noah if Margaret couldn't keep that promise? Rebecca found herself thinking about Noah at odd moments throughout her days, during charity board meetings, while selecting produce at the organic market, as she passed the closed door of the nursery that still waited, empty and expectant. She wondered about his day at school, whether he'd eaten a proper lunch, if he missed having friends over. The apartment was too small, Margaret too unwell for such normal childhood socialization. These thoughts came unbidden, filling spaces in her mind that had previously been occupied by fertility treatment schedules and disappointed hopes. One evening, she realized she hadn't checked her period tracking app in weeks. The first time in years she'd lost track of her cycle, the endless vigilance of trying to conceive finally loosening its grip. Jonathan, too, found himself changed by their involvement with Noah and Margaret. The boy's questions about his work, asked with genuine curiosity rather than the polite interest of business associates, made him see his own achievements through fresh eyes. "You make computers think better?" Noah had asked, trying to understand what Jonathan's tech company actually did. The simple question had made Jonathan pause, struck by how much clearer his purpose seemed when distilled through a child's understanding. Years of corporate jargon and strategic planning boiled down to making things work better, a mission he'd almost forgotten in the pursuit of growth metrics and market share. The Gardners never discussed what was happening, this gradual entanglement of their lives with Noah and Margaret's. They operated in a strange limbo, neither acknowledging nor questioning the hours spent in the small apartment, the resources directed toward helping the small family. It was as if they feared naming it might break the spell, returning them to the polite distance and quiet disappointment that had characterized their marriage in recent years. Instead, they moved in parallel, united in purpose if not in conversation, their shared concern for Noah creating a bridge across the gulf between them. Until the night Rebecca found Jonathan standing in the doorway of the unused nursery, staring at the empty crib they'd never had the heart to dismantle. "I keep thinking about his mother," Jonathan said without turning, sensing Rebecca's presence behind him. Working as a maid, raising a child alone, then getting sick. He rarely spoke so openly, emotion usually buried beneath layers of practiced control. Noah could have been anyone's child. He could have been ours. The words hung in the air between them, laden with possibilities never realized. Rebecca moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel his warmth but not touching, that invisible barrier still present despite everything. "Margaret won't be able to care for him much longer," she said quietly, giving voice to the thought they'd both been avoiding. "Her health is better, but Dr. Mercer says the diabetes has done permanent damage to her heart. It's just a matter of time." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions about what would happen then, about what role they would play in Noah's uncertain future. Summer arrived, bringing with it warm days that Noah spent increasingly in the gardener's expansive backyard, Margaret resting in the shade while he explored the gardens under Rebecca's watchful eye. The arrangement had evolved naturally. Margaret needed rest. Their home offered space and fresh air that the small apartment lacked, and Noah thrived in the freedom of the outdoors. Jonathan found himself leaving work earlier, the promise of hearing Noah's excited recounting of his day's discoveries more compelling than late meetings or business dinners. They never discussed how temporary or permanent these arrangements might be. They simply lived each day as it came, creating a fragile happiness none of them acknowledged for fear it might shatter. "He asked about his father yesterday," Margaret told Jonathan one evening as they sat on the patio, watching Rebecca help Noah identify different butterfly species in a nature book. The older woman's voice was low, meant only for Jonathan's ears. "He's never really asked before. I think seeing you with him, it's making him curious." Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest, responsibility, concern, an emotion he couldn't quite name. "What did you tell him?" he asked, keeping his own voice equally quiet. Margaret's eyes remained on her grandson, affection and worry mingling in her gaze. The truth, that his father wasn't ready to be a parent, that some men don't know how to love properly, that not having him doesn't mean Noah isn't lovable. The words struck Jonathan with unexpected force. His own father had been physically present, but emotionally distant, measuring love in achievements and expectations rather than affection. It had shaped him in ways he was only now beginning to recognize. His drive for success, his difficulty expressing emotions, his fear of failing as a father himself. Watching Noah laugh at something Rebecca said, Jonathan wondered what kind of father he would have been to the children they couldn't have. What kind of father he could be to a boy who had never known one. The thought both terrified and compelled him, a possibility he had never allowed himself to consider until Noah had climbed over his garden wall in search of flowers for his mother's grave. Rebecca had noticed the changes in her husband over the past months, the softening around his eyes, the way he actually listened when Noah spoke instead of just waiting for his turn to talk, as he often did in business settings. She had fallen in love with a different version of Jonathan years ago, before ambition and social climbing had hardened him, before their fertility struggles had created a wall of mutual disappointment between them. Glimpses of that man had begun to reappear in moments with Noah. Patient explanations of how things worked, gentle guidance rather than criticism, quiet pride in the boy's accomplishments. It awakened something in Rebecca that she had thought buried beneath years of failed IVF treatments and specialist appointments. Hope, not just for motherhood, but for her marriage. One warm evening, as fireflies began to appear in the gathering dusk, Noah's voice broke the comfortable silence on the patio. "Can I call you Uncle Jonathan and Aunt Rebecca?" he asked suddenly, looking up from the puzzle they'd been working on together. The simple question carried weight far beyond the words themselves. Margaret's breath caught audibly beside them, and Rebecca felt tears spring unexpectedly to her eyes. It was Jonathan who answered, his voice unusually thick. "We would be honored, Noah," he said simply, reaching out to ruffle the boy's hair in a gesture that had become natural over the weeks. Something settled between them all in that moment, acknowledgement of the bonds forming, family being created not through blood, but through choice and care and presence. Later that night, alone in their bedroom for the first time in months, without the careful distance they'd maintained, Rebecca turned to Jonathan in the darkness. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady despite the significance of what she was about to suggest. "If something happens to Margaret, Noah will need somewhere to go, someone to care for him." Jonathan was silent, but she knew he was listening, could feel the tension in his body beside her. "We could apply to become his guardians. Maybe even—" She hesitated, the word both frightening and exhilarating. "Maybe even adopt him eventually." The silence stretched between them, and Rebecca held her breath, uncertain whether she had given voice to a shared desire or revealed a longing her husband didn't share. "I've been thinking the same thing," Jonathan finally admitted, his voice quiet in the darkness. "But I wasn't sure if it would feel like giving up on having our own." The old pain surfaced briefly, Years of temperature tracking and hormone injections and anxious 2-week waits, all ending in disappointment. Rebecca found his hand in the darkness, lacing her fingers through his in a gesture of intimacy they hadn't shared in too long. "Noah needs a family," she said simply. "And maybe we do too." It wasn't a decision, not quite yet, but it was an opening, a possibility that hung between them like the first light of dawn after a long night, tentative but full of promise. For the first time in years, they fell asleep facing each other rather than turned away, the space between them no longer vast and unbridgeable. The conversation with Margaret was more difficult than either of them had anticipated. Pride and love wrestled visibly across the older woman's face as they carefully broached the subject of becoming Noah's legal guardians in case of emergency. They sat at her small kitchen table, Noah having been sent to play with a neighbor's child to give them privacy. "I know what you're really asking," Margaret said finally, her gnarled fingers wrapped around a teacup she hadn't drunk from. "You want to know if I'll let you raise him when I'm gone." The directness was characteristic of her. No pretense, no dancing around difficult truths. Rebecca and Jonathan exchanged glances, neither denying her assessment. "We've grown to love him," Rebecca said simply, "and we want what's best for him." Margaret's eyes, so like Noah's in their depth and perception, studied them both carefully. "And you think that's you? Your big house, your important jobs, your money?" There was an edge to her voice that made Jonathan sit straighter. "No," he said, surprising both women with his vehemence. "It's not about what we have. It's about who he is. Smart, kind, brave. He deserves every opportunity, every chance to become whoever he wants to be." Jonathan leaned forward, more earnest than he'd been in any business negotiation. "But more than that, he deserves to be loved, and we do love him, Margaret. Not because he fills some void in our lives, but because he's Noah." Margaret's expression softened slightly, the defensiveness giving way to the exhaustion she fought daily to hide. "You think I haven't worried about this? Haven't lain awake, wondering what will happen to him?" Her voice caught, emotion briefly overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. "He's all I have left of my Elena. The thought of not seeing him grow up." She didn't finish, didn't need to. The grief was etched in the lines of her face, in the slight tremor of her hands as she finally lifted the teacup to her lips, more for something to do than from thirst. "Would you," she began, then paused to steady her voice, "would you let me stay part of his life? Let him know where he came from, who his mother was?" "We would insist on it," Rebecca said firmly, reaching across the table to cover the older woman's hand with her own. "Noah needs you, Margaret. We're not trying to replace anyone in his life, and not you, not Elena. We just want to be there for him too." The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Margaret looked down at Rebecca's manicured hand, covering her own work-worn one. The visual contrast between their lives stark, but the shared concern for Noah bridging the gap between their worlds. When she looked up again, there was a weary acceptance in her eyes, tinged with both sadness and relief. "I'll need to think about it. And talk to Noah. This has to be his choice too." The following weeks brought a fragile new understanding. Legal consultations conducted discreetly, paperwork drafted but not yet filed. Noah, when carefully sounded out by Margaret, had responded with the simple logic of childhood. "But I already have a mommy in heaven. Count Rebecca and Uncle Jonathan would just be my earth mommy and daddy, right?" The question had brought tears to Margaret's eyes, both for its innocent wisdom and for the acceptance it revealed. Noah had already begun to see the Gardners as family, had already carved out space in his heart for these people who had entered his life because of stolen flowers. Summer faded into early autumn, leaves beginning to turn as Noah started first grade. With the Gardners' help, he had transferred to a better school closer to their neighborhood, though they maintained the fiction that he still lived primarily with Margaret. The arrangement worked. Noah spent weekdays with his grandmother in the apartment they had helped renovate, with better heating and accessibility features, while weekends were spent at the Gardners' home, where a bedroom that had once been designated as a nursery had been redecorated with space-themed wallpaper and filled with books. Margaret's health stabilized with proper medical care, but everyone understood the reprieve was temporary. The paperwork for legal guardianship waited. A contingency plan none of them wanted to need, but all were grateful to have. On a crisp Saturday morning in October, Jonathan found himself alone with Noah in the garden, the boy helping him plant tulip bulbs that would bloom in spring. Rebecca had taken Margaret to a doctor's appointment, routine monitoring that nonetheless left a shadow of anxiety over their weekend. Noah worked diligently, his small hands carefully placing each bulb in the holes Jonathan had dug, covering them with the precise amount of soil Rebecca had demonstrated earlier. "Uncle Jonathan," he said suddenly, pressing the soil down with focused attention, "when tulips grow from bulbs, are they the same flower as before or a new one?" The question caught Jonathan off guard, philosophical territory he hadn't expected from a 6-year-old. "Well," he began, considering his answer carefully, "they're connected to the original, but they're also new. The bulb holds everything the flower needs to become itself again when the time is right." Noah nodded seriously, accepting this explanation as he reached for another bulb. "Like memories," he said simply. "Nana says memories of my mom are like seeds inside me that grow when I need them." Jonathan felt his throat tighten at the boy's words, at the wisdom that came from navigating loss at such a young age. "Your Nana is very smart," he managed finally. Noah looked up then, his earnest face smudged with garden soil in a way that reminded Jonathan forcefully of their first meeting months earlier. If Nana has to go be with Mommy someday," Noah said, his voice small but steady, "would I really get to stay with you and Aunt Rebecca forever?" The directness of the question made Jonathan's heart lurch, the vulnerability behind it almost unbearable. He set down his trowel deliberately, giving the boy his full attention. "Yes, Noah, if that happens, and we all hope it won't for a very long time, you would stay with us forever. We would be your family." Something in the boy's expression shifted. A tension releasing that Jonathan hadn't fully registered was there. "Would I call you Dad then?" Noah asked, the question hanging between them like a fragile thing that might shatter if handled roughly. Jonathan felt emotion rise in his chest, threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. "You could," he said gently, "if that felt right to you. Or you could keep calling me Uncle Jonathan. What matters is that we would be family either way." Noah considered this, his small face serious with thought. "I think," he said finally, returning to the tulip bulbs with careful hands, "I would like to have a dad. Mommy always said everyone deserves a dad who loves them, even though mine didn't stay." The simplicity of the statement, delivered while methodically planting flowers that would bloom long after winter's end, struck Jonathan with the force of revelation. This small boy, who had lost so much, still held enough hope to imagine a future where love could grow again, like bulbs planted in autumn soil. That evening, after Noah had gone to bed in his space-themed room, Jonathan found Rebecca sitting alone on the patio, wrapped in a light blanket against the autumn chill. He told her about his conversation with Noah, his voice occasionally catching as he recounted the boy's words. Rebecca listened silently, tears gathering in her eyes, but not falling. When Jonathan finished, she reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had once been automatic between them, but had become precious again in its rediscovery. "I used to think," she said softly, "that the worst thing that could happen to us was not having a child. Now I understand the worst thing would have been never knowing Noah." The admission carried with it years of pain, of treatments and disappointments and grief for children who existed only in their imagination. "We can't replace what he's lost," Jonathan said, echoing the concern that sometimes kept him awake at night. "His mother, his grandmother eventually, we can't erase that pain for him." Rebecca nodded, understanding the fear behind his words, the worry that they wouldn't be enough, that Noah's past losses would make him unable to accept their love fully. "We don't have to replace anything," she said finally. "We just have to be here, be steady. Love isn't about erasing pain, Jonathan. It's about making sure he doesn't face it alone." In the quiet that followed, something settled between them, a shared purpose stronger than the individual dreams they had once pursued separately, a foundation rebuilt on something more enduring than their previous definitions of success or family. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, Margaret's neighbor's frantic voice explaining that the ambulance had already left for the hospital. Jonathan was in a board meeting when his assistant interrupted with the news. He left without explanation, his expensive suit jacket abandoned on his chair as he raced to his car. Rebecca was already at the hospital when he arrived, her face pale but composed as she waited outside the emergency room. "Heart attack," she said simply when he reached her. "They're working on her now." Noah sat beside her, small and quiet, his backpack from school still clutched in his hands, as if letting go might cause everything else to slip away too. The hours that followed blurred together, doctors' updates delivered in hushed tones, coffee that grew cold in styrofoam cups, Noah eventually falling asleep across uncomfortable waiting room chairs, his head pillowed on Rebecca's lap. Late in the night, the doctor emerged with the news they had feared. Margaret had stabilized, but the damage was extensive. "She's asking for you," the doctor told them gently. "All of you." Jonathan lifted the still sleeping Noah carefully, the boy instinctively wrapping his arms around Jonathan's neck without fully waking. Together, they followed the doctor through quiet hospital corridors to the intensive care unit, where Margaret lay surrounded by machines, their steady beeping the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Noah stirred as they entered, blinking sleepily before his eyes widened at the sight of his grandmother. Margaret looked small and fragile against the white hospital linens, her skin ashen, but her eyes clear as they fixed on her grandson. "There's my brave boy," she whispered, her voice weak but determined. Jonathan set Noah down gently, and the child approached the bed with the cautious steps of someone who understands the gravity of a moment beyond their years. Rebecca stood close behind him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder in silent support. "Nana," Noah said, his voice small in the sterile room, "are you going to be okay?" The question hung in the air, its innocence heartbreaking in its hope. Margaret reached out a trembling hand, and Noah took it carefully, mindful of the IV line. "I'm very tired, sweetheart," she said honestly, "and I miss your mommy very much." Noah nodded, accepting this in the way children sometimes can, with a wisdom adults forget how to access. "If you need to go be with mommy, it's okay," he said solemnly, tears gathering in his eyes but his voice steady. "Uncle Jonathan and Aunt Rebecca will take care of me. We already planted tulips that will bloom in spring." Margaret's eyes met Jonathan's over Noah's head. Gratitude and question mingled in her gaze. Jonathan nodded once, a solemn promise that required no words. They would be there for Noah, would love him and protect him and help him grow. "I need you to remember something important, Noah," Margaret said, her voice growing fainter with the effort of speaking. "Your mommy loved you more than anything in this world, and so do I." Noah nodded, a tear finally escaping to trace a path down his cheek. "I know, Nana, I love you too." Margaret's gaze shifted to Rebecca, who had moved to stand beside Jonathan, their shoulders touching in unconscious unity. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, "for loving him, for seeing him." The simple acknowledgement contained multitudes, gratitude, blessing, a passing of responsibility from one generation to another. Rebecca could only nod, words inadequate for the moment's weight. Margaret lived through the night, but slipped away peacefully the next morning, Noah holding one hand and Rebecca the other, Jonathan standing guard over them all like a sentinel. The funeral was small but dignified, arranged and paid for by the Gardners, but planned according to notes Margaret had left in her apartment, her final act of organization for the grandson she had raised with such fierce love. Noah stood between Rebecca and Jonathan at the graveside, his small hand clutched tightly in each of theirs, forming a chain of support that would not break. He placed a single white lily, root ball intact, on the fresh earth beside the headstone that would now bear two names. Mother and daughter reunited in that final gardened rest. Life reorganized itself around their new reality, with the resilience children often inspire in those who care for them. The guardianship papers, signed by Margaret before her heart attack as if she had sensed time growing short, transitioned smoothly into adoption proceedings with the blessing of social workers who recognized the bond already formed between Noah and the Gardners. Noah's room, once a nursery filled with dreams, then a weekend space for visits, became permanently his, filled with books and drawings and the mementos Margaret had saved from his early years. School routines established themselves, friendships formed, and life continued in the way it always does, even after loss. One day following another, healing happening in the spaces between breaths. Spring arrived, as it always does after winter's grief, and with it came the tulips Noah and Jonathan had planted together in the garden, red and yellow and pink blooms reaching toward the sun as if in celebration. On a warm Sunday morning, Noah stood before them in quiet contemplation, his face tilted toward their bright colors. "They remembered to grow," he said simply when Rebecca joined him, slipping her hand into his. Jonathan appeared on Noah's other side, the three of them forming the same chain they had created at Margaret's funeral months earlier, but now in celebration rather than mourning. "They always remember," Jonathan confirmed, squeezing Noah's hand gently. "That's the magic of gardens. Nothing truly ends. It just changes form and waits for the right moment to bloom again." Later that afternoon, they visited the cemetery together, a ritual they had established every few weeks. Fresh flowers for Elena and Margaret, time for Noah to talk to his mother and grandmother if he wished. As Noah carefully arranged their garden offerings, Rebecca leaned against Jonathan, his arm automatically coming around her shoulders, in a gesture that had become natural again after years of distance. "Do you ever think about how strange it is?" she asked quietly. "How our lives changed because a little boy needed flowers for his mother's grave." Jonathan watched Noah, now humming softly as he worked, a child who had experienced more loss than many adults, but who somehow maintained a capacity for joy that humbled them daily. "I used to think success was something you built," Jonathan replied, his voice low enough that only Rebecca could hear. "A company, a reputation, a fortune. Now I understand it's something you grow." He looked down at his wife, at the contentment in her face that had replaced years of longing and disappointment, like tulip bulbs in autumn, or a family that forms in unexpected ways. Noah looked up then, catching them watching him, and his smile, open and trusting despite everything, was answer enough to questions they hadn't known to ask that morning months ago when they had found a small boy stealing flowers from their garden. Some thefts, it seemed, were really gifts in disguise, second chances disguised as moments of loss, love growing in the most unexpected soil. As they walked back to the car together, Noah between them swinging their hands in the spring sunshine, Jonathan reflected on the strange and winding path that had led them here, not to the family they had once imagined, but to the family they had found, or perhaps the family that had found them, one flower at a time. The garden of second chances had bloomed around them all, roots intertwining beneath the surface, stronger for having weathered winter's loss together. And in that knowledge was a peace none of them had expected to find when Noah had first climbed over a stone wall in search of flowers for his mother's grave.